Jumbee by Henry S. Whitehead. Mr. Granville Lee, a Virginian of Virginians, coming out of the World War with a lung wasted and scorched by mustard gas, was recommended by his physician to spend a winter in the spice and balm climate of the Lesser Antilles, the lower islands of the West Indian archipelago. He chose one of the American islands, St. Croix, the old Santa Cruz, island of the Holy Cross, named by Columbus himself on his second voyage, once famous for its rum. It was to Geoffrey de Silva that Mr. Lee at last turned for definite information about the local magic. Information which, after a 2 months' residence, accompanied with marked improvement in his general health, he had come to regard as imperative from the wetting glimpses he had received of its persistence on the island. Contact with local customs, too, had sufficiently blunted his inherited sensibilities to make him almost comfortable as he sat with Mr. de Silva on the cool gallery of that gentleman's beautiful house, in the shade of 40 years' growth of bougainvillea, on a certain afternoon. It was the restful, gossipy period between 5 o'clock and dinner time. A glass jug of foaming rum swizzle stood on the table between them. "But tell me, Mr. de Silva," he urged, as he absorbed his second glass of the cooling, mild drink, "have you ever actually been confronted with a Jumbee? Ever really seen one? You say, quite frankly, that you believe in them." This was not the first question about Jumbees that Mr. Lee had asked. He had consulted planters. He had spoken of the matter of Jumbees with courteous, intelligent, coloured storekeepers about the town, and even on Christiansted, St. Croix's other and larger town on the north side of the island. He had even mentioned the matter to 1 or 2 coal-black sugar-field labourers, for he had been on the island just long enough to begin to understand, a little, the weird jargon of speech which Lafcadio Hearn, when he visited St. Croix many years before, had not recognized as English. There had been marked differences in what he had been told. The planters and storekeepers had smiled, though with varying degrees of intensity, and had replied that the Danes had invented Jumbees to keep their estate labourers indoors after nightfall, thus ensuring a proper night's sleep for them and minimizing the depredations upon growing crops. The labourers whom he had asked had rolled their eyes somewhat, but, it being broad daylight at the time of the inquiries, they had broken their impassive gravity with smiles and sought to impress Mr. Lee with their lofty contempt for the beliefs of their fellow blacks, and with queerly phrased assurances that Jumbee is a figment of the imagination. Nevertheless, Mr. Lee was not satisfied. There was something here that he seemed to be missing, something extremely interesting, too, it appeared to him, something very different from Brer Rabbit and similar tales of his own remembered childhood in Virginia. Once, too, he had been reading a book about Martinique and Guadeloupe, those ancient jewels of France's crown, and he had not read far before he met the word zombie. After that he knew, at least, that the Danes had not invented the Jumbee. He had heard, though vaguely, of the labourers' belief that Sven Garrick, who had long ago gone back to his home in Sweden, and Garrity, one of the smaller planters now on the island, were wolves. Lycanthropy, animal metamorphosis, it appeared, formed part of this strange texture of local belief. Mr. Geoffrey de Silva was 1/8 African. He was, therefore, by island usage, coloured, which is as different from being black in the West Indies as anything that can be imagined. Mr. de Silva had been educated in the continental European manner. In his every word and action, he reflected the faultless courtesy of his European forebears. By every rite and custom of West Indian society, Mr. De Silva was a coloured gentleman, whose social status was as clear-cut and definite as a cameo. These islands were largely populated by persons like Mr. De Silva. Despite the difference in their status from what it would be in North America, in the islands it had its advantages, among them that of logic. To the West Indian mind, a man whose heredity is 7/8 derived from gentry, as like as not with authentic coat of arms, is entitled to be treated accordingly. That is why Mr. De Silva's many clerks, and everybody else who knew him, treated him with deference, addressed him as Sir, and doffed their hats in continental fashion when meeting. Salutes which, of course, Mr. De Silva invariably returned, even to the humblest, which is one of the marks of a gentleman everywhere. Geoffrey De Silva shifted one thin leg, draped in spotless white drill, over the other, and lighted a fresh cigarette. "Even my friends smile at me, Mr. Lee," he replied, with a tolerant smile, which lighted for an instant his melancholy, ivory-white countenance. "They laugh at me more or less because I admit I believe in Jumbees. It is possible that everybody, with even a small amount of African blood, possesses that streak of belief in magic and the like. I seem, though, to have a peculiar aptitude for it. It is a matter of experience with me, sir, and my friends are free to smile at me if they wish. Most of them, well, they do not admit their beliefs as freely as I, perhaps." Mr. Lee took another sip of the cold swizzle. He had heard how difficult it was to get Geoffrey De Silva to speak of his experiences, and he suspected that under his host's even courtesy lay that austere pride which resents anything like ridicule, despite that tolerant smile. "Please proceed, sir," urged Mr. Lee, and was quite unconscious that he had just used a word which, in his native South, is reserved for gentlemen of pure Caucasian blood. "When I was a young man," began Mr. De Silva, "about 1894, there was a friend of mine named Hilmar Iverson, a Dane, who lived here in the town, up near the Moravian church, on what the people call Found Out Hill. Iverson had a position under the government, a clerk's job, and his office was in the fort. On his way home, he used to stop here almost every afternoon for a swizzle and a chat. We were great friends, close friends. He was then a man a little past 50, a butter tub of a fellow, very stout, and, like many of that build, he suffered from heart attacks. One night, a boy came here for me. It was 11 o'clock, and I was just arranging the mosquito net on my bed, ready to turn in. The servants had all gone home, so I went to the door myself, in shirt and trousers, and carrying a lamp, to see what was wanted, or rather, I knew perfectly well what it was, a message to tell me that Mr. Iverson was dead." Mr. Lee suddenly sat bolt upright. "How could you have known that?" he inquired, his eyes wide. Mr. De Silva threw away the remains of his cigarette. "I sometimes know things like that," he answered slowly. "In this case, Iverson and I had been close friends for years. He and I had talked about magic and that sort of thing a great deal. Occult powers, manifestations, that sort of thing. It is a very general topic here, as you may have seen. You would hear more of it if you continued to live here and settled into the ways of the island. In fact, Mr. Lee, Iverson and I had made a compact together. The one of us who went out first was to try to warn the other of it. You see, Mr. Lee, I had received Iverson's warning less than an hour before. I had been sitting out here on the galley until 10 o'clock or so. I was in that very chair you are occupying. Iverson had been having a heart attack. I had been to see him that afternoon. He looked just as he always did when he was recovering from an attack. In fact, he intended to return to his office the following morning. Neither of us, I am sure, had given a thought to the possibility of a sudden sinking spell. We had not even referred to our agreement. Well, it was about 10, as I said, when all of a sudden I heard Iverson coming along through the yard below there, toward the house, along that gravel path. He had, apparently, come through the gate from the Kongens Gade, the King Street, as they call it nowadays, and I could hear his heavy step on the gravel very plainly. He had a slight limp, heavy crunch, light crunch, heavy crunch, light crunch, plod, 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 plod. Old Iverson to the life. There was no mistaking his step. There was no moon that night. The half of a waning moon was due to show itself an hour and a half later, but just then it was virtually pitch black down there in the garden. I got up out of my chair and walked over to the top of the steps. To tell you the truth, Mr. Lee, I rather suspected, I have a kind of aptitude for that sort of thing, that it was not Iverson himself. How shall I express it? I had the idea, from somewhere inside me, that it was Iverson trying to keep our agreement. My instinct assured me that he had just died. I cannot tell you how I knew it, but such was the case, Mr. Lee. So I waited, over there, just behind you, at the top of the steps. The footfalls came along steadily. At the foot of the steps, out of the shadow of the hibiscus bushes, it was a trifle less black than farther down the path. There was a faint illumination, too, from a lamp inside the house. I knew that if it were Iverson himself, I should be able to see him when the footsteps passed out of the deep shadows of the bushes. I did not speak. The footfalls came along toward that point and past it. I strained my eyes through the gloom, and I could see nothing. Then I knew, Mr. Lee, that Iverson had died, and that he was keeping his agreement. I came back here and sat down in my chair and waited. The footfalls began to come up the steps. They came along the floor of the gallery, straight toward me. They stopped here, Mr. Lee, just behind me. I could feel Iverson standing there, Mr. Lee. Mr. De Silva pointed to the floor with his slim, rather elegant hand. Suddenly, in the dead quiet, I could feel my hair stand up all over my scalp, straight and stiff. The chills started to run down my back and up again, Mr. Lee. I shook like a man with the ague, sitting here in my chair. I said, "Iverson, I understand. Iverson, I'm afraid." My teeth were chattering like castanets, Mr. Lee. I said, "Iverson, please go. You have kept the agreement. I am sorry, I am afraid, Iverson. The flesh is weak. I am not afraid of you, Iverson, old friend. But you understand, man. It's not ordinary fear. My intellect is all right, Iverson, but I'm badly panic-stricken. So please, go, my friend." There had been silence, Mr. Lee, as I said, before I began to speak to Iverson, for the footsteps had stopped here beside me. But when I said that, and asked my friend to go, I could feel that he went at once, and I knew that he had understood how I meant it. It was sudden, Mr. Lee, as though there had never been any footsteps, if you see what I mean. It is hard to put into words. I dare say, if I'd been one of the labourers, I should have been halfway to Christiansted through the estates, Mr. Lee, but I was not so frightened that I could not stand my ground. After I had recovered myself a little, and my scalp had ceased its prickling, and the chills were no longer running up and down my spine, I rose, and I felt extremely weary, Mr. Lee. It had been exhausting. I came into the house and drank a large tot of French brandy, and then I felt better, more like myself. I took my hurricane lantern and lighted it, and stepped down the path towards the gate leading to the Kongensgade. There was one thing I wished to see down there at the end of the garden. I wanted to see if the gate was fastened, Mr. Lee. It was. That huge iron staple that you noticed was in place. It has been used to fasten that old gate since some time in the 18th century, I imagine. I had not supposed anyone had opened the gate, Mr. Lee, but now I knew. There were no footprints in the gravel, Mr. Lee. I looked carefully. The marks of the bush broom, where the houseboy had swept the path on his way back from closing the gate, were undisturbed, Mr. Lee. I was satisfied, and no longer, even a little, frightened. I came back here and sat down, and thought about my long friendship with old Iverson. I felt very sad to know that I should not see him again alive. He would never stop here again afternoons for a swizzle and a chat. About 11 o'clock I went inside the house and was preparing for bed when the rapping came at the front door. You see, Mr. Lee, I knew at once what it would mean. I went to the door in shirt and trousers and stocking feet, carrying a lamp. We did not have electric light in those days. At the door stood Iverson's houseboy, a young fellow about 18. He was half asleep and very much upset. He cut his eyes at me and said nothing. "What is it, mon?" I asked the boy. "Mistress Iverson sent ask you, sir. Please come to the house. Mr. Iverson die, sir." "What time did Mr. Iverson die, mon? You hear?" "I ain't able to say what o'clock, sir. Mistress Iverson come wake me, where I sleep in a room in the yard, sir, and send me please call you. I think he die about an hour ago, sir." I put on my shoes again, and the rest of my clothes, and picked up a St. Kitts supplejack. I'll get you one. It's one of those limber grapevine walking sticks, a handy thing on a dark night, and started with the boy for Iverson's house. When we had arrived, almost at the Moravian church, I saw something ahead, near the roadside. It was then about 11:15, and the streets were deserted. What I saw made me curious to test something. I paused and told the boy to run on ahead and tell Mrs. Iverson I would be there shortly. The boy started to trot ahead. He was pure black, Mr. Lee, but he went past what I saw without noticing it. He swerved a little away from it, and I think perhaps he slightly quickened his pace just at that point, but that was all. "What did you see?" asked Mr. Lee, interrupting. He spoke a trifle breathlessly. His left lung was, as yet, far from being healed. "The hanging Jumbee," replied Mr. De Silva in his usual tones. "Yes, there at the side of the road were 3 Jumbees. There's a reference to that in The History of Stuart McCann. Perhaps you've run across that, eh?" Mr. Lee nodded, and Mr. De Silva quoted, "There they hung, though no ladders rung supported their dangling feet." And there's another line in The History, he continued, smiling, which describes a typical group of hanging Jumbee. "Maiden, man-child, and shrew." Well, there were the usual 3 Jumbees, apparently hanging in the air. It wasn't very light, but I could make out a boy of about 12, a young girl, and a shriveled old woman, what the author of The History of Stuart McCann meant by the word shrew. He told me himself, by the way, Mr. Lee, that he had put feet on his Jumbees mostly for the sake of a convenient rhyme, poetic license. The hanging Jumbee have no feet. It is one of their peculiarities. Their legs stop at the ankles. They have abnormally long, thin legs, African legs. They are always black, you know. Their feet, if they have them, are always hidden in a kind of mist that lies along the ground wherever one sees them. They shift and weave, as a full-blooded African does, standing on one foot and resting the other. You've noticed that, of course, or scratching the supporting ankle with the toes of the other foot. They do not swing in the sense that they seem to be swung on a rope. That is not what it means. They do not twirl about. But they do, always, face the oncomer. I walked on slowly and past them, and they kept their faces to me as they always do. I'm used to that. I went up the steps of the house to the front gallery and found Mrs. Iverson waiting for me. Her sister was with her, too. I remained sitting with them for the best part of an hour. Then, 2 old black women, who had been sent for into the country, arrived. These were 2 old women who were accustomed to preparing the dead for burial. Then I persuaded the ladies to retire and started to come home myself. It was a little past midnight, perhaps 12:15. I picked out my own hat from 2 or 3 of poor old Iverson's hats that were hanging on the rack, took my supple jack, and stepped out of the door onto the little stone gallery at the head of the steps. There are about 12 or 13 steps from the gallery down to the street. As I started down them, I noticed a 3rd old black woman sitting, all huddled together, on the bottom step, with her back to me. I thought at once that this must be some old crone who lived with the other 2, the preparers of the dead. I imagined that she had been afraid to remain alone in their cabin, and so had accompanied them into the town. They are like children, you know, in some ways, and that, feeling too humble to come into the house, she had sat down to wait on the step, and had fallen asleep. You have heard their proverbs, have you not? There's one that exactly fits this situation that I had imagined. Cockroach no wear crockin' boots when he creep in foul house. It means be very reserved when in the presence of your betters. Quaint, rather, the poor souls. I started to walk down the steps toward the old woman. That scant half-moon had come up into the sky while I had been sitting with the ladies, and by its light everything was fairly sharply defined. I could see that old woman as plainly as I can see you now, Mr. Lee. In fact, I was looking directly at the poor old creature as I came down the steps, and fumbling in my pocket for a few coppers for her, for tobacco and sugar, as they say. I was wondering, indeed, why she was not by this time on her feet, and making one of their queer little bobbing bows. Cockroach bow to fowl, as they might say. It seemed this old woman must have fallen into a very deep sleep, for she had not moved at all, although ordinarily she would have heard me, for the night was deathly still, and their hearing is extraordinarily acute, like a cat's or a dog's. I remember that the fragrance from Mrs. Iverson's tube roses, in pots on the gallery railing, was pouring out in a stream that night, making a greeting for the moon. It was almost overpowering. Just as I was putting my foot on the 5th step, there came a tiny little puff of fresh breeze from somewhere in the hills behind Iverson's house. It rustled the dry fronds of a palm tree that was growing beside the steps. I turned my head in that direction for an instant. Mr. Lee, when I looked back down the steps, after what must have been a fifth of a second's inattention, that little old black woman who had been huddled up there on the lowest step, apparently sound asleep, was gone. She had vanished utterly, and, Mr. Lee, a little white dog, about the size of a French poodle, was bounding up the steps toward me. With every bound, a step at a leap, the dog increased in size. It seemed to swell out there before my very eyes. Then I was really frightened, thoroughly, utterly frightened. I knew if that animal so much as touched me, it meant death, Mr. Lee, absolute, certain death. The little woman was a Chien, of course. You know of lycanthropy, wolf change, of course. Well, this was one of our varieties of it. I do not know what it would be called, I'm sure. Canicanthropy, perhaps. I don't know. But something first cousin once removed from lycanthropy. And on the downward scale, Mr. Lee, the old woman was a were-dog. Of course, I had no time to think, only to use my instinct. I swung my supple jack with all my might and brought it down squarely on that beast's head. It was only a step below me, then, and I could see the faint moonlight sparkle on the slaver about its mouth. It was then, it seemed to me, about the size of a medium-sized dog, nearly wolf size, Mr. Lee, and a kind of deathly white. I was desperate, and the force with which I had struck caused me to lose my balance. I did not fall, but it required a moment or two for me to regain my equilibrium. When I felt my feet firm under me again, I looked about frantically on all sides for the dog, but it, too, Mr. Lee, like the old woman, had quite disappeared. I looked all about, you may well imagine, after that experience, in the clear, thin moonlight. For yards about the foot of the steps, there was no place, not even a small nook, where either the dog or the old woman could have been concealed. Neither was on the gallery, which was only a few feet square, a mere landing. But there came to my ears, sharpened by that night's experiences, from far out among the plantations at the rear of Iverson's house, the pad of naked feet. Something was running desperately off in the direction of the center of the island, back into the hills, into the deep bush. Then, behind me, out of the house onto the gallery, rushed the two old women who had been preparing Iverson's body for its burial. They were enormously excited, and they shouted at me unintelligibly. I will have to render their words for you. "Oh, the good God protect you, Master Jaffrey, sir. The Jumbee, the Sheen, Master Jaffrey. He go, sir." I reassured the poor old souls and went back home. Mr. De Silva fell abruptly silent. He slowly shifted his position in his chair and reached for and lighted a fresh cigarette. Mr. Lee was absolutely silent. He did not move. Mr. De Silva resumed, deliberately, after obtaining a light. "You see, Mr. Lee, the West Indies are different from any other place in the world, I verily believe, sir. I've said so, anyhow, many a time, although I've never been out of the islands except when I was a young man, to Copenhagen. I've told you exactly what happened that particular night." Mr. Lee heaved a sigh. "Thank you, Mr. De Silva, very much indeed, sir," he said thoughtfully, and made as though to rise. His service wristwatch indicated 6 o'clock. "Let us have a fresh swizzle, at least, before you go," suggested Mr. De Silva. "We have a saying here, in the island, that a man can't travel on one leg. Perhaps you've heard it already." "I have," said Mr. Lee. "Knud, Knud, you hear, man? Knud, tell Charlotte to mash up another barrel of ice, you hear? Quickly now," commanded Mr. De Silva. Hello, everyone. I hope you are well, and I hope that you enjoyed that reading of Jumbee by Henry S. Whitehead. So this is a pretty interesting story, although it's not particularly complex. This was a story that was published in Weird Tales in 1926. Henry S. Whitehead is not a very well-known author, and when he is known, or when people do know him, it's usually in connection to H.P. Lovecraft. Because Whitehead was a friend and correspondent of Lovecraft, they both published in Weird Tales, and then from there they started corresponding, and Lovecraft even made a trip to Florida and spent some time with Whitehead, where apparently they had discussions about things and enjoyed each other's company. Henry S. Whitehead was a journalist and also a priest for some time. His writing that does exist is quite varied. When he was younger, he wrote various pieces for journals and newspapers, but when he got older, he discovered Weird Tales and pulp magazines, which is quite interesting, and then he decided he wanted to write stories for these. And he drew on his experience living in the Caribbean as inspiration for some of these stories. So he wrote a lot of voodoo stories. The book that I have, which is a collection of his work, it's called Jumbee and Other Voodoo Tales. And there is a lot. It's probably, how many pages? Nearly 200. And it's all his voodoo tales, which were published in Weird Tales and other pulp magazines. The reason that before I said that it was interesting or surprising that Whitehead was a fan of Weird Tales is because Whitehead, for part of his life, was actually a priest. And he was stationed in the Caribbean, that's why he was there, and did this for many years, apparently. And of all the people who I would think would have appreciated Weird Tales at the time, priests would have been fairly low on that list. And actually, I guess another factor, which I would not expect of the usual reader of Weird Tales, was that Whitehead also had a PhD. So really, he was Dr. Whitehead. And I wouldn't have expected that for most of the readers of Weird Tales. Considering that Whitehead had a PhD, it's not really surprising then that he got on with Lovecraft, because Lovecraft was a fairly academic guy. He was an amateur in a lot of things, but he was fairly scholarly. So anyway, I've digressed a little bit. But to get back to the point, it was a bit surprising to me that a priest with a PhD was into Weird Tales. And really, with Weird Tales, he found a writing niche that he hadn't before. Whitehead, as I had said, had written stories before, but they tended to be in different genres. And when he discovered Weird Tales, he sort of found a genre that he could really get into. And so the voodoo tale sort of became his thing, and he wrote a lot of them, and some of them are really good. This story is fairly basic. It's not a bad story. I think there's actually a fair bit going on in it that's quite interesting, but it is a basic story and it's fairly quick, which was one of the reasons I chose to do it. So what is interesting about this story? Well, I think the first thing is the Jumbee aspect. The mythology of the Jumbee has come down to us through the years as the mythology of the zombie. Jumbee is, of course, a variation on the word zombie, but it's also a bit different. I was doing some research, and Jumbees are spirits or ghosts or apparitions. So they're not a zombie in the way we would think of a modern zombie, which is the reanimated dead. A Jumbee is more like a ghost. The Jumbee that we see in this story, or rather the Jumbees, plural, which we see, it's not clear whether they are ghosts of deceased people or other kinds of spirits. One of the reasons that I'm not sure whether the Jumbees are meant to be the ghosts of deceased people is because of the way they present themselves. We're told that there are 3 Jumbees in the hanging Jumbee, which is what the apparition is called, which De Silva in the story sees. And the 3 figures in the hanging Jumbee are a old woman, I think a middle-aged woman, and a young boy. This is interesting because this is almost archetypal. It's similar to the maiden, the mother, and the crone, which can be seen in a variety of folklore, especially like I think Slavic folklore. And, even in things like Macbeth, where you have the weird sisters, they conform to this archetype. And what they represent is the stages of life, particularly for women. So the young stage, which is the maiden, the middle age, which is the mother, and old age, which is the crone. And the Jumbees, the hanging Jumbee in this story, seems to represent that a little bit. There's a young boy, a mother, and then a shrew or an old woman. What exactly that means, I'm not sure. And one of the reasons I find this to be a simplistic story is that there's no deeper meaning to the appearance of the Jumbee. Geoffrey de Silva is going to see his friend, and the Jumbees appear, but does it have any connection to the events that are happening, like the death of his friend? It doesn't appear so. It seems to just be something which happens. And similarly, the appearance of the lycanthropic woman at the end of the story, the Sheen, as it's called, also does not seem to have a particular meaning assigned to it. Why does De Silva see the Sheen? We don't really know, and we never find out. It just runs off. So, in a sense, I guess the story is a bit anticlimactic in that there isn't a greater significance. I did find the presentation of both the Jumbee and the Sheen pretty effective, though. The Jumbee, I found, was quite creepy, especially the fact that it doesn't have feet, and the way it was described as hanging was weird. And also, the one thing I thought was really creepy was the fact that it looks at you. They apparently just stare at you as you walk by, and they follow you, they face you the whole time while you're walking by them. That was pretty eerie. The other thing that I thought was quite eerie and really made me stop and think was whether the boy who was with Geoffrey de Silva saw the Jumbee, because de Silva describes the boy as sort of reacting to it, but not really. He says that he tells the boy to go on, and the boy walks past the Jumbee and maybe looks at it a little bit or quickens his pace, but doesn't react at all. And I wondered whether the boy saw the Jumbee but didn't want to show he was afraid, or he assumed that De Silva wouldn't see it, and because of that he didn't react. I don't really know, but it's an interesting thing to think about. I was talking about the Jumbees and the Sheen as if they are the central part of the story, but really, this is a ghost story in many ways, because De Silva's experience centered around the death of his friend, where his friend, Iverson, comes back to show him proof of the afterlife. And it's for that reason that De Silva goes to his friend's house after he's passed away and to talk to his wife and comfort her. So really, that's the central part of the story, is De Silva's experience with the ghost of his friend. And then on the way, he sees the Jumbee and the Sheen. And then in the end, he just goes back home, and that's sort of the end of it. Let's discuss De Silva a bit, though, because I find Jaffrey da Silva a very interesting character. He is, for the most part, our viewpoint character because we're hearing him narrate his own experiences, so it's from his perspective. But really, the story of Jumbee follows Granville Lee. That's the name of the character, and he's a soldier who's been fighting in the First World War, and he is injured by mustard gas, and he's sent to the Caribbean to recover, and that's where he meets Jaffrey da Silva, who tells him this story. The inclusion of Granville Lee is almost superfluous because really the story is all about da Silva, and Granville Lee only bookends the story. He is, in a way, he's necessary because da Silva is telling his story to somebody who is not experienced in these things and is an outsider, and that's why he has to explain things. The story works in this sense because we are in the same position as Mr. Lee. We don't know anything about voodoo, especially, or the folklore of the island where the story is set. So having a character who's not familiar with it is important so that da Silva can explain what's happening. The reason da Silva is interesting is because he is our link between the local folklore of the islands and the, I guess, American society, which is who this story was aimed at. And da Silva's link between these two worlds is not just that he's aware of the mythology of the islands, it's also that he has African heritage. And for that reason, he has a foot in both worlds. He says that because he has African heritage, he is more prone to believe in these things, and maybe even to see these things and to experience them. But in addition to this, his unique perspective on folklore, we're told that da Silva was also educated in the European style, right? So presumably he's a wealthy man and he went to boarding schools or private schools, and so he's been brought up and educated in this way. This is indicated in a very clever way in the story. So da Silva speaks to Lee just using his normal English, but da Silva also speaks the patois of the islands where he lives, and we see him use this language skill whenever he's talking to people who have grown up on the island. So we're shown that he is a bridge between these worlds, not just in that he has heritage from both of the different groups on the island, but also that he can move between them fairly seamlessly, and presumably he's accepted by both. I thought this was a very clever way that Whitehead introduces the story and allows us to sort of see the authenticity of what da Silva is saying. We get the sense that da Silva, he's giving us the real deal when he talks about these things. He's not just somebody who's interested, he's somebody who lives within this world and therefore is an authority on the Jumbee and other supernatural phenomenon which goes on the island. Anyway, that's all from me for today. I hope you enjoyed the story. It was a pretty interesting curiosity, I thought. I may do some more Henry S. Whitehead stories in the future. There are quite a few stories from his book that I like. And I've also seen that apparently Whitehead wrote a sword and sorcery short story, which I thought would be pretty cool to check out. I don't know if it's any good, but if it is good, I will probably do an audiobook of it. Anyway, that's all from me for now. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you have a good day. See ya. If you've enjoyed this content, consider supporting the Eldritch Archives to grow and make more content. Become a supporter on Patreon, buy an audiobook on Bandcamp, or like, comment on, or share one of the videos on YouTube. And as always, thank you for listening.